Isn't Trump an absolute anomaly?
Trump's slogan is "Make America Great Again." Biden's slogan was "Build America Back Better." What's the difference? We are talking about civilian nuclear power. Do we need it? I think my answer is. And somebody came and said, why don't we cut ties? If I was the dictator of Singapore, I will cut ties with Israel like that. If you can tell me, then the Israelis will stop doing what they are doing. Will they? Is it going to make any difference?
Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going global. He's Singapore's most candid diplomat. He's a part provocateur, part policy oracle. From the United Nations to the Istana, he's called it like it is for over 4 decades.
Damn.
You may not always agree with him, but you'll never catch him dodging a question. Please welcome the one and only Mr. Bilahari Kausikan.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me, but one clarification.
Yes, sir.
I'm a pensioner, not a diplomat anymore.
One might say that diplomacy is a life's calling.
Diplomacy is a job, just like any other job, okay? It's a type of civil servant, that's all.
Right. How does one come to such a job?
Me, by accident. My accident was when I finished the army, I got a scholarship to do a PhD. The scholarship was from the American government. It's a Fulbright scholarship.
Wow.
Nothing to do with the Singapore government, but of course the Singapore government decides to bond you.
That's one.
And in those days was 8 years. I was supposed to serve my bond in the University of Singapore, now NUS. While I was doing my PhD, where I was writing my dissertation, it's a very long process in the US, I realized that, do I really want to be an academic? If I didn't want to be an academic, why the hell do I need a PhD? Right? PhD is an academic trade union card. So I went back and of course got threatened by the PSC. Oh, you cannot break your bond. And I said to them, listen carefully. I never said I'm going to break my bond. I just said I don't want to serve it in the university. The then chairman of the board, I shan't mention his name, he's passed away. Finally he intervened. He said, okay, the boy wants to work, let him work.
Yeah.
Where you want to work? So I just said, MFA. I knew something about it because my father had been there. I actually no intention of joining it, but that's the first name of a government organization that popped into my head. Right. So I went there intending to serve my bond and leave, but then I forgot to leave. So by the time I realized it was way past my bond, then I said, okay, I think I'm having fun and I think I'm quite good at this. So why bloody leave? So that's the rest. So it's a bit of accident.
I see.
But you had to fall in love with the nature of the work.
No, I was always interested in international relations.
Yeah.
My PhD was supposed to be on international relations. But I realized the academic study of international relations, I found it very abstract and mechanical when I was doing the PhD. Actually working at international relations, I found out if there was any resemblance between what I had studied and what I did for a living, it was purely coincidental. And I've told my old professors this, I said, sure, don't say things like that.
But you have, right? Because you've gone back to universities and you have...
No, I've given talks at universities. Yeah. I just came back from a long trip where I gave a talk. I was invited to give a lecture at Columbia University where I was pretending to do a PhD. Right? So I don't mind being in university, but I don't think I'm the academic type. Right? So it's just as well for Singapore, for students, and for me that I changed my mind.
There's another thing that people have been calling you recently, not recently, actually for a long time, is that they call you intimidating. Is this something like a persona you adopted or story?
You are here with me. Am I intimidating? I always
when you ask it like that,
No, honestly, I think before the episode, before you arrived, I think we were all a little bit intimidated based on what we've seen online. But I think meeting you so far, I think
what have you seen online that is so intimidating?
No, literally, I tried to chat GPT you. It says intimidating.
It's
GPT. Come on.
What input did they get?
But I am curious to know whether it's like what he mentioned, right? Is it like a persona that you kind of adopted because it's beneficial maybe in your line of work or something along those lines?
No, I think I'm just me. If some people find it intimidating, that's their fault, not mine.
I do feel like the job of a diplomat is, we've all heard about it. We kind of know what it is. We see them around Singapore and yet at the end of the day, I feel like there's a lot to this job that we don't understand. You don't see children growing up one day saying that, I want to be a diplomat one day, because we don't actually know what that job is, right? And the example I give is that if, let's say right now, and I do want to talk about the tariff situation and get your perspective of it, but let's say if Singapore has to go and negotiate with the US on, let's say, a new free trade agreement or a version of it, what is that meeting? What actually takes place?
Well, first of all, the meeting itself, there will be not one meeting, there will be many meetings. I'll just use a free trade agreement, not necessarily with the US.
Okay.
Right? A free trade agreement is a very complex treaty. It has many facets. It covers a whole wide range of subjects. Yeah. So there's not one person that could possibly have enough domain knowledge in each of those facets. So it's usually a team. Right. There is a team leader. It's called the chief negotiator, but actually the negotiations are done at different levels, and only when everybody cannot resolve it at that level, it's raised to a higher level, and then the chief negotiators meet and try to resolve it. But it's a long, painstaking process covering many domains. And before you get to a position on any particular domain, let's say there will be a domain on, say, banking. Of course, the lead in that will be somebody from MAS. But before we get a common Singapore position, there will be a very elaborate and sometimes very tedious interagency process between many agencies to come a common Singapore position. And you can imagine that multiplied. I just use this thing about banking as an example.
Yeah.
Multiplied many times in many domains. So it's a very complicated process. On the other hand, when you say diplomacy, I told you at the very beginning, it's just a form of civil servant. Your basic job as a diplomat is to represent Singapore, to advance Singapore's interests, and if they are under attack in one way or the other, to defend them. In common language, diplomacy means being agreeable, being diplomatic means being agreeable.
It feels like the designated friend.
Being pleasant and all that. Yeah. But you must never forget that your fundamental job is to advance Singapore's interests. Preferably by being pleasant and agreeable and all that, but if necessary, by whatever means works. People should not lose sight of the fact that you are there not to make friends for the sake of making friends. You are there to make friends because that may be the best way in order to advance your national interests. But you are there to reach an agreement because that is the best way to advance your national interests. Equally, your national interests may be advanced by not reaching an agreement. That means it may be a bad agreement that's trying to be forced on you, right? All right. So you must not agree to it just for the sake of having an agreement. You should not be pleasant just for the sake of being pleasant. You must be pleasant because that's the best way of getting something done. And usually it is the best way, but not always.
So recently we had Minister Ong Ye Kung on, and he mentioned that at bilats and multilateral summits, actually what we see on the itinerary, the printed one, is just for show. But the real stuff happens behind the scenes on the sidelines. What actually happens? We also want to know.
No, I mean, depends, it really depends. If you have, let's say, a multilateral meeting, like ASEAN or the UN, what happens in the meeting itself is the result of a long process of preparation, of negotiation, formal or informal, right? And the meeting itself is the playing out. It's almost ritualistic, all right? But the ritual is important.
Even with Western countries?
Every country.
Right.
Every country. Western countries is even more performative, because they like to be sanctimonious in public and they feel good. And they always mistake feeling good with actually doing good. All right. Feeling good about themselves, I mean.
Is there a difference in how Singaporean delegates meet with a certain country versus another? Like how you deal American versus Chinese delegates?
Well, yeah, because there are cultural differences, which you can't deny. There are differences of style. It's not just the country, it's the person too. All right, that you're meeting. Right?
Give us an example.
I've known this guy 20-something years. He was dealing with ASEAN from the point of, he's American, I can tell you that much, right? So one day we are in a room, right? In our delegation room. And he came in, wants to see me, and then he wanted us to do something. So I got fed up, and I know how to deal with him. There's no point being too polite. So I just said something that I should not say on air, off.
You can say here on air.
This is not TV.
No, so then he came back. I also feel a bit shy. I don't mind telling him. So he came, put his head in the door and says, F you 2. I said, F you 3. And then we came to some agreement. But that
After
is,
that, you have to become friends, like, you know.
we were friends before. Now I won't talk to him like that. If I'm just meeting him I've known him for 20, maybe
Then the
26,
young
27
intern learning
years.
how to be a diplomat, just see you going like,
My whole delegation was there. I was the leader, the senior officials leader. But they know me and they know this guy too. So that's the only way to deal with him. Because some other person, of course, I won't do that.
So if you want to arrive at a negotiating table and you want a good position, you want to have some cards. But like, for instance, I just thought about this. Prime Minister announced that we're looking into nuclear power, right? As a way forward for energy. We would obviously have to deal with a nuclear power that knows everything they're doing. And then we are the small boys who don't know anything. How do we hold our own at that table?
First of all, whether or not we have a nuclear reactor, we are talking about civilian nuclear power, it will be a national decision. It is in order under the non-proliferation treaty to have peaceful use of nuclear power. So there will be not too much negotiation about that. It is a national decision that we have to make. Will Singaporeans accept it? Do we need it? I think my answer is definitely we need it, right? Will Singaporeans accept it? Well, that's for the politicians to persuade them. The expertise we don't have right now, but that can be learned. You can acquire it. It's not that you are trying to make nuclear weapons. That will be a very foolish thing for us to try to do in the first place. And we're not that stupid. We only look stupid, but we're not really that stupid. Okay. Anyway, our conventional defense is more than adequate for our needs, right?
Yeah.
The kind of thing you're talking about, yes, we need to develop the domain knowledge, but we can.
When we go and ask for domain knowledge, what is Singapore typically offering in return?
No, because it's public domain knowledge. You don't have to ask anybody for any stickers.
Which we did, right? We had an agreement in the US for knowledge sharing.
Oh no, that is U.S. Singapore Nuclear Cooperation Treaty. It's also called colloquially a 123 treaty because it is under Article 123 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and many countries have it. I mean, dozens of countries have it. That just enables the U.S. to help us, or we can seek help from the U.S.
Right.
If we do have eventually a nuclear reactor, right? But it's not something that we need to demand from the US. How to run a nuclear reactor, we will have to learn from the person we buy it to because we can't make it ourselves. Right? So, and it's usually part of a deal that they will train you.
And speaking of like the US and just US relations and trade wars, and do you think the soft wars we're seeing, do you think they will maybe escalate into a hard war?
Oh no, I think that the probability of that is extremely low. Conflict and the possibility of conflict are inherent characteristics of international relations. They are never absent. Sometimes at high probability, sometimes in low probability. But in US-China relations, I think the key factor is that they are both nuclear weapon states. There has never been a direct conflict since 1945 when nuclear weapons were used for the first and only time in anger, and never been a direct conflict between two nuclear weapon states. Nuclear deterrence works. It keeps the peace. The conflicts are between proxies of nuclear weapon states, people who are careless or foolish enough to become proxies or allow themselves to be used as proxies. So I don't think that is the big risk in US-China relations. The risk is of an accident getting out of hand because they are not communicating. But if you are talking specifically about trade, there's a wrestling ring. There's these two huge hulking wrestlers. One is China, one is US. They are in the ring already because you put tariffs, I put tariffs, right? And they are glaring at each other, they are shouting at each other, they are snarling at each other. But they really don't want to fight because they're going to hurt each other. They know it. But they don't want to lose face. They don't want to look weak either. So who is going to make the first move? They have made it both pretty clear. Trump has made it pretty clear. He wants a deal. The Chinese said, we are willing to have a deal, but not under threat. Now, what does it mean by being under threat, right? So this is where we are now. It's quite disruptive because even these huge hulking monsters snarling at each other causes collateral damage to people around it. The spit comes out to the audience and so on, right? So that's where we are now. It's not a good place to be. But I don't think, as I look at it, I mean, I could be wrong because there's no right or wrong. They want to come to an agreement. They know they must come to agreement because they know, much as the US wants to de-risk from China, it is impossible to separate completely. Much as China wants to become self-sufficient, and they have made some progress in certain technology areas, they cannot separate entirely either. They know it. In fact, they have signaled to each other quite clearly. That's where we are. And that's not kind of unusual in international relations among major powers.
You did mention one part about the only possibility is if there's an accident.
against our head.
Yeah, what is an accident?
A collision between a Chinese ship and or a Chinese plane and an American plane.
Right.
It happened before. It happened in 2001. There was a collision between a Chinese fighter jet who was getting too close to intercepting. Intercepting will always go on. American surveillance aircraft. The Chinese pilot was killed. The surveillance aircraft managed to crash land on Hainan Island. And after a while, they both settle it and send the crewman and the wreckage of the plane home. But that in 2001, the internet, social media is in its infancy. It was hardly existed, particularly in China. So they could control people's emotion.
Right.
Now it's going to be harder and harder.
Like, but isn't this the job of diplomats? If, for example, national leaders here are trying to save face, isn't this the job of the diplomats to connect first?
All right. In that context, they need to open channels of communication.
Yeah.
But I don't think either is ready to do it yet at a very senior level. This thing can't be done by the Chinese embassy in Washington or the American embassy in Beijing. It has to be at some higher level.
Yeah.
There will be an opportunity to open a channel of communication pretty soon. I forgot the exact dates, but end of April, early May is usually where the World Bank, IMF have one of their 2 annual meetings in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And the Chinese are going to send a pretty senior person. They usually do, to attend those meetings, and it would not be unusual for him to meet Secretary of the Treasury, Besson, right? So I don't know whether they will use that opportunity, but there will be opportunities. Now, whether either side is ready to use them, and they can easily open channels of communication if they want to.
They're probably back-channeling now, right?
I'm not sure they are back-channeling now, because anyway, they're both grumbling about each other not having channels. So you might be right. That's maybe a sign that they are. At a very junior level, I must say, right? But still, there are channels.
There's a running joke around the streets of China that Trump calls President Xi. Yeah. And then he reaches his voicemail and says, sorry, I come pick up your, sorry, you have reached the voicemail. And then Trump will tweet out, I called him and he apologized.
Well, that's how all major powers behave. I don't get too excited about this kind of thing.
You don't?
I do
Isn't
not.
Trump an absolute anomaly?
Actually not. I think he is as much a symptom of a broader phenomenon as he is the cause of it. He may be a catalyst. In other words, he speeds up processes. But the processes are what threw him up. And what's that process? The most important one is the end of the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US does not face any existential threat anywhere in the world. Right. China is a formidable competitor, but it's not an existential threat. Russia is very dangerous, and Russia is certainly an existential threat to Ukraine and to some of the European countries, particularly the Baltic states, but not to the US.
Right.
And you could say the same thing of Iran in the Middle East or North Korea in Northeast Asia. They may be serious threats or even existential threats to their immediate environment, but not to the US. And if that is so, why should the US, to kind of paraphrase John F. Kennedy at the height of the Cold War, bear any burden, pay any price, fight any foe in order to uphold its idea of international order?
Yeah.
In other words, to put it in another way, it's time to put America first.
Yeah.
To use Trump.
But haven't they benefited ridiculously with being that nation that is everywhere? Like USAID.
They have also paid a huge price for it in blood and in treasure. So actually, ever since the end of the Cold War, the foremost priorities of every post-Cold War American president have been domestic, with George W. Bush as a slight exception because of 9/11. Right? Trump's slogan is "Make America Great Again." Biden's slogan was "Build America Back Better."
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Yeah.
Trump is very transactional, right? Biden was more consultative, but he's not consulting you saying, "Hey, bro, how's your family?" He's consulting you to see what you can do for him. In other words, he's politely transactional, and Trump is just transactional.
Right.
So I think you have to see him in this broad context. The US was very open in its trading regime during the Cold War and for some time after. Why? Not out of the altruism, as a weapon of the Cold War. To bind its allies and friends to it by opening its markets generously and so on. not because it was altruistic, but in his own self-interest. Now, Trump has another view of this thing, and I think it's a mistaken view. But that's, we don't get a vote in the US election. And about half the Americans seem to agree with him.
Yeah.
They may be regretting it now, and I think they will regret it in time to come. But, it's their choice, and the rest of us will have to adapt to it.
Yeah.
And so what we do get a vote is our position in this, right? And so how do we...
Our position is, first of all, you have to know the limits of what you can do. You are not going to be able to influence these two big guys, right? They have their own considerations. So you have to look after yourself first. We can look after ourselves because we have the capability, we have the resources, and we have actually prepared ourselves for this kind of thing, not this exact situation. We are not clairvoyant. But very long time ago, then Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong in the early 2000s recognized that the multilateral trade liberalization system, the Doha round of the WTO, was not going to work. So we better get ourselves a safety net by having all kinds of bilateral and plurilateral free trade agreements. Now, despite we have a free trade agreement with the US, that's why we're just at the baseline level of 10%, which is not good, but it is certainly better than, say, 46% for Cambodia and so on, 100 and something percent for China, right? And we have free trade agreements with Japan, with India, with the EU, with China, with Australia and New Zealand, one combined one, and with dozens of other smaller countries. So we have that safety net. We'll have to use it. It's going to be difficult because world trade is generally going to slow down, right? I don't think the globalization as a whole is going to be totally reversed, despite the best efforts of both the US and China, because they know that they are intertwined. But it will slow down, it will become patchy. But I think we can survive this if we keep calm, keep our heads, and keep cohesive, right? One thing this whole Trump tariff shows is how central the US still is to the world economy. Right? If it was not so central, nobody would be so upset. But it is very central. It is the largest economy. It is still the most creative economy, innovative economy. Earlier this year, I met some Chinese entrepreneurs in a meeting in Europe, and I was talking to them. And they were running unicorns, what they call unicorns, which is, market cap is about $1 billion. And they all had one thing in common. They all were of the view that if you want to raise capital in a big time, only in the US. No other capital market is going to make any difference. So I say about Hong Kong, they just dismiss Hong Kong. I say about Tokyo, forget it. London, no, have to go in the US. And they only have a problem because they are Chinese companies. So they're going to wait it out. They're going to find all kinds of ingenious ways. But they all are united in this firm belief there is no substitute for the US.
Why your perspective on why globalization will not go back again? Some people, for example, are thinking maybe we wait it out till after Trump's term. Why is that not possible?
Because I think that, first of all, on the US side, the domestic support for the previous trade regime is gone. Biden's trade policies were based towards China in particular, were basically Trump's policies. Right? More politely presented, as I said, right? But they're basically policies. So I don't think that domestic base of the old trade policy is going to come back magically just because Trump is no longer president, right? Secondly, other countries, not everybody, fortunately, ASEAN countries have been smart enough not to try to retaliate, because why are you going to retaliate? You bite the fellow's ankle, he won't even notice, okay? You only get irritated and hit you harder, right? So, but EU and other countries are going to have, for their own domestic political reasons, to make some gesture. Having made this gesture, it's very hard to take back, because that gesture will benefit certain people, or certain sectors, or certain industries, or certain groups of some kind, right? And after that, you want to take back. Politically, I'm not saying it's impossible.
It's political suicide domestically. Right.
But the real reason is globalization is another term we give to this very complex web of supply chains. It can bifurcate, it will come patchy, and and the supply chains may take a longer way around and so on. But in the end, it will more or less hold together.
Earlier on, we were discussing just, people's perceptions. And we have this theory, want to see what you feel about it. Singaporeans, like the common person, overestimates our place in the world. And we take it that we are some sort of big player with a large pool. And this overestimation quite dangerous. But how do you feel about this?
I think the two extremes are dangerous. There are a group of Singaporeans that they think the world revolves around ourselves, right? No, get real, my friend. Right? But there's another group of Singaporeans who think that we are completely powerless. Both are wrong and both are dangerous. Actually, we have agency. We can do things, right? But we have to keep our heads. We have to keep united and we have to think. We can, because if not, we shouldn't be sitting here talking to each other. Yeah. Singapore should not exist. Right. When we were, had independence thrust upon us. But we use what agency we have quite well. And by using it well, you get more. I put it in a very crass way, right? Small countries are always going to be primarily price takers rather than price setters. Right? That's a fact of life. Whether a small company, small country, but that doesn't mean you're totally helpless. So you can influence things to some degree, provided you don't overreach yourself and provided you don't get paralyzed like, a rabbit in the headlights. It's so bad, I can't move, right? Yeah. So those two extremes are bad.
I think what broke this impression that I had about what transpired this conversation during lunch, right, was that I think I had a conversation with one of a cabinet minister, and which I will not name now, and he shared with me when they send negotiating teams over to say US. Many people only see when the minister posts, right, it's like, on the way to go and negotiate this, going to meet my counterpart. But what they don't see is the hours and weeks of paperwork. They're going there, they're waiting outside the waiting room, they're actually shitting themselves. They're a bit concerned because things are dangerous, it's precarious. There are other countries there waiting their turn to negotiate. And then you see another country get booted out within 5-10 minutes of a talk, and then they're like, and
I think that's a bit of an exaggeration too. Negotiating with, let's say, Malaysia is going to be very different from negotiating with the US or China or India. That is a fact of life. But it doesn't mean that you're powerless. The negotiation can only succeed if you have something to offer, and it may not be a very large thing, but you are a credible country, right? So you have some things to offer. To put it crassly, I said, you're a small country. There's always going to be asymmetries of power. Doesn't mean you're helpless. So the range of options of a small country is always going to be narrower than the range of options of a big country. Yeah. But if you are a rich small country, you are certainly going to have much more options than a poor small country. And we are fortunate to be, thanks to previous generations' work, a rich small country. You have more options. Why would Japan or the US or India or China or Australia, even Australia and New Zealand, want to have a free trade agreement with us? And we have with all of this and more if we had nothing to offer. Because we are a logistics center, we are a banking center, we are a trade center. So there is some value in working with us. Right. Not because of the Singapore market per se. It's tiny, it's minuscule, right? But because we can be a hub for them in the region. This is a bit controversial. My colleagues in ASEAN and the ASEAN Secretariat, my ex-colleagues,
you're a pensioner now.
I'm a pensioner, would disagree, but they, in public anyway. ASEAN likes to talk of itself as the 5th largest economy in the world, market of 700 million and so on. But the fact of the matter is we are still very largely 10 separate economies. Right? But also the fact of the matter is we are a crucial hub in that 10 economies, linking them actually. I'll give you one example. The stock of American investment in Southeast Asia is greater than the stock of Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean investment combined.
Wow. Okay.
All right. Wow. And I would say at least 80% of that is in Singapore. Right. Okay.
So it's just Singapore, like.
Why? Because they need to go into the Southeast Asian market. Yeah. This is a more friendly. It's a more predictable because it's governed by law. It's business friendly. It's a more comfortable place for foreigners of all kinds, not just Americans to live. Yeah. So many multinationals have their regional headquarters, although not always called that because they don't want to upset the other markets, in Singapore de facto. Right? And that's what I think, much more than anything else, Singaporeans need to understand. They are understandably upset because they say, oh, foreigners taking my job, too many foreigners here, and so on, and so on. Yeah, I can understand emotion. But first of all, there are some jobs you don't want to do, right? You know, you want to go and build buildings. Which Singaporean, you want your children to grow up to be construction workers, right? Really? No, okay, that one I think more or less people have accepted, right? At that level. But at in the financial industry, in the MNCs, this is a small place. And much as we may like to think otherwise, not every Singaporean is a great talent, you know. So you do need some, I hate that word, actually, foreign talent, all right? Okay? And if you don't get promoted, it's not because some foreigner was favored over you. It may be because you are just not good enough. That's very hard emotionally for people to accept. Okay?
But you need to
Today we are meeting a diplomat with nothing to lose.
No, it is.
No, I agree.
It's true. Come on, because in any job, in any bureaucracy, when I was PermSec, you got to tell people, sorry, every year promotion exercise, sorry you didn't get promoted. You are not supposed to tell them certain parts of their assessment, right? I always tell them, it's the CEP, what we call CEP, the current estimated potential. That's how you promote. That means I promote you not for your past performance, because that I give you bonus if you did well, right? But I promote you because I think your future, you can do this in the future, right? So that is not supposed to be revealed to the person. I have to explain to the whoever why and why not, but I'm not supposed to reveal it. I always tell them, you want, I'll tell you. But I'll tell you, but you make sure you really want,
You can handle the truth.
Be careful what you wish for.
Can you handle it or not? Because there are people, they are extremely good at this level, but they'll be very bad if you just put them one step other, right?
I'm glad we've entered your controversial hot take moment
It's not
right
controversial.
now. Maybe it's a truth bomb at least. But also because I'm glad you brought up ASEAN, because I want to find out from you, because we've seen in the past decades, so China has been encroaching on ASEAN sovereignty a lot, and they're starting to assert, with their navy all over the SCS. But then you also have to see how Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, all of them have to turn on a dime now that the US isn't claiming to be there to support.
Cozying up.
Exactly. And so now that China is no longer the only belligerent, how do you rank the objectives?
All countries in the world, and in particular Southeast Asia, but not solely Southeast Asia, face two sets of realities. One, I think it is quite well accepted that we have to work with both the US and China. And you have to work with both as a necessary condition of working with either effectively. Because if the US is not around, you're going to have to deal with China in a situation of extreme asymmetry, which is, the US provides the balance that only the US can provide.
Right.
But if there's no China, the US will take you for granted. And it has in the past, okay? So you need to work with both in order to work with either effectively. But at the same time, I think everybody has concerns about certain aspects, one aspect or another, of Chinese behavior and American behavior, right? So under those circumstances, what do? You have to work among yourselves and with other partners. Nobody is ever going to shun China or ever going to shun the US. Now, in Xi Jinping's recent tour, what did he get actually? He got a lot of nice words, but what did he get actually? Can China substitute for the US as a market? I think anybody who thinks that, or thinks it can be a total substitute, partially maybe. Because first of all, China has got serious structural economic problems of its own.
Right.
And secondly, these tariffs are not going to help those problems of their own. So they have got huge excess capacity, not just in EVs and batteries, in everything from, refrigerators to, toasters or whatever, right? And there are concerns in ASEAN countries that cheap Chinese exports are destroying local industry. You have those concerns in Thailand, you have those concerns in Malaysia, you have those concerns in Indonesia. So these are it's a very complex equation. It's not that I don't trust you, I go to you. Right? This is what Singaporeans also need to understand. Singaporeans tend to look at international relations like a football match. You either you win, you lose, you draw. Right? It's not. It's not a simple binary game. It is a complex game. Right?
4D chess.
For something like that. Okay? It's a bit of a cliche, but it is like that. Okay.
5D chess.
You got the right idea. So there are many choices, and the more complex the environment, actually the more opportunity you have to exercise your agency.
So how is Malaysia doing this as a chair? They're cozying up to China a lot.
All right, but they're chair only for the rest of this year.
Sure.
No, look, I think Malaysia, overreacted. And I know because Malaysians have told me so, that Anwar Ibrahim is probably so upset with the West generally over Palestine and other things like that, that he's not thinking, he's a smart man, you know. He's not thinking in a completely balanced way. But they have also they have not cut any relations with the US. I think this understanding that you have to work with both in order to work with either. It's a better understanding now than 20 years, 30 years ago. You remember at the end of the 1980s, you probably don't remember, you're too young, right? Not personally. Not personally remember. Okay, you read about it. The end of 1980s, well, a combination of factors, the Filipino domestic politics, natural disaster and so on. The US had to leave Subic Bay and Clark Airfield in the Philippines. And we have always thought that you need some physical US military presence in Southeast Asia to maintain balance. Right? So we offered the use of our facilities. Now, this is not going to substitute for Subic Bay, because if you've ever been there, you will know that if you drop the Singapore main island to Subic Bay, we will never be found again. But anyway, politically, diplomatically, it is important for us. So we offered the use of our facilities. And in 1990, we signed an MOU with the US to give this into effect. What happened? All hell broke loose. Our neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia, reacted hysterically, right? Trying to pressure us to rescind the agreement. Of course we did, right? That's 1990. Fast forward to 2019 when we renewed that agreement. It's not secret agreement, by the way. We renewed it. It was a signing between then PM Lee Hsien Loong and President Trump, the first term, in the UN in New York, right? What happened then? The simple answer is nothing happened. Not a whimper of protest from anybody, right? Why?
What changed?
Well, who changed? They changed their minds. Why? I wish I could claim this as a great success or Singapore diplomacy. It isn't. It is a great failure of Chinese diplomacy. Right? Because of the South China Sea, because of everything. Everybody needs to work with China, but everybody has anxieties of China. And the only way you can assuage their anxieties is to have a balance. Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and old enemy are all doing what they can quietly to improve their defense ties with the US. And that's a huge change. There will always be things they can't do for domestic political reason or other. I would say that now, far from being what we do with the US to keep the US anchored in the region, letting them use our facilities and so on, is now regarded as something of a regional public good.
It's like our contribution to the neighborhood.
I mean, they will never admit it, but they admit it by not protesting when we do things. In fact, joining in.
So much to ask.
How does all of this play into or how does it affect everyday Singaporeans?
They don't understand it. They don't recognize it. And they ought to. This is one of the reasons I agreed to come and talk to you.
We're so glad.
Speaking of everyday Singaporeans, you often talk about how our foreign policy needs to be rooted in realism rather than idealism, and something that
you need both.
Yeah, a bit of both. But I think what we've seen with especially younger generations is that they tend to favor idealism. They tend to want more value-based approaches. Is in your years of observation, do people outgrow idealism, or is there something about this generation that we need to engage with?
I think they need to understand that even if you have ideals and you want to advance your ideals, right? I'll be very concerned if the young people had no ideals, okay? Right? But if you want to advance your ideals, you have to deal with the world as it is. You're not going to advance your ideals by just sitting down and focusing, praying, somehow wishing, right? You have to work with the material you have, with the environment you have, and find a way to advance your ideals given that. And the basic reality of international relations is that countries are motivated by national interests. And because national interests sometimes clash, and the work of diplomacy is to ensure to try to align the interests. Not always possible, but if they're not possible, try to minimize the friction between different interests. And if the interests already clash, to make sure yours prevail. The younger generation does not understand that, yes, if this was a world, as we are often fond of saying, and I've said it myself, a world governed by international law and international organization is clearly a better world for small countries. That's like saying water is wet, right? But is this such a world? And the answer is only in certain domains and only occasionally.
Yeah.
That's why we have to have a strong defense to be able to deter. It's always easier to let diplomacy work if the person you are dealing with understands that the alternative diplomacy is not going to work. Okay.
Got a bigger stick than them.
No, you don't have to use it, but they just let them know. You don't have to wave it around.
If I could venture into probably a bit more sensitive waters, right? I think back home, there is almost a section of Singapore that disagrees with the government's position in demanding, for example, Singapore cut ties with Israel. It's to the point whereby I do feel on social media there is some form of a great wall, if you will, that we almost don't talk about it because one is of practical reasons and one is of an ideology.
I can understand why people in Singapore are upset about what's happening to Gaza. Right? I can understand that. I can empathize. But, having empathy is a bit different from what your national interests are. I once told, not so long ago, I was giving a group closed-door talk and somebody came and said, why don't we cut ties? I said, okay. If I was the dictator of Singapore, I will cut ties with Israel like that. Tomorrow. If you can tell me, then the Israelis will stop doing what they are doing. Will they? Is it going to make any difference? So we will cut off our nose because we do have interest with Israel, not just military interests, other things. So what for? This is what I call mistaking feeling good for actually doing good. Right? You will feel good for 5 minutes if you cut ties. Or some people will, right?
Yeah.
And then the next day, everything goes on. This is a bit to your point that some people think that we have a bigger role in the world than we really are. Right?
No, but the argument to that is that Singapore could perhaps be one of the beacons to lead this by being one
so
of
what?
the
If
ones
everybody
to
cuts ties with Israel, you think Israel is going to commit suicide out of the chagrin? Right?
I think they won't ever make a change until the US does that, but the US is never, right?
Or if the US does it, and the US is not going to do it. So you this is what I call feeling good, mistaking feeling good for actually doing good.
So what is
and I think what you need, okay, we have made our views clear. Many ministers have made it. They made their views clear that, we think Israel probably has gone a bit too far. Although that is also a very complicated issue when you have an enemy that hides its military assets in the middle of civilian infrastructure. What are you supposed to do? Right? Okay, but anyway, that's a separate issue. So we have made our views clear. That's all you can do. We have made our views clear through our votes in the UN. We have made our views clear in Parliament by ministerial statements, not just by Vivian Balakrishnan, but I think Shanmugam has also said things and so on, right? If you want to cut your ties, I told this small group, if I was the dictator of Singapore, I would cut ties like that. If you can tell me that the next day Israel will say, oh my God, the Singaporeans cut ties with us. We better stop, we better all commit suicide because, submit to Hamas because the Singaporeans don't like us anymore. You think they will do that? Come on, get real.
No, but it's a tough position to take in that conversation when someone's being really emotional about it because you're taking the stand of genocide.
No,
it's
but
the counter, right?
Okay, but then what happened 7 October, is that also acceptable?
Yeah, but then they will then bring up to before 7 October, the people of Hamas are living under occupation.
Okay, let's go back to history. In 1947, the UN had a plan to divide this area into two parts, one a Jewish state, one a Palestinian state. After some hesitation, the Jews agreed to the plan. The Arabs didn't. So the next year, 1948, Israel was formed. And the Arabs respond by all of them attacking Israel.
The war.
Right? The 1948 war. And it's been kind of the prospects of the two-state solution has been going downhill ever since. Right? There was a moment of glimmer of hope with the Oslo Accords, right? But that last flicker of hope was extinguished on 7 October 2023 when the Hamas attacked and carried out horrific terrorist attacks in Israel. Now, we have to keep the idea. I cannot see now, frankly, any viable path this way now, right, to a two-state solution, right? But we have to keep the idea alive as a means of managing this conflict at least. So until the war finally ends, I cannot see right now any viable path. But I can see that you must keep the idea alive as Many international problems cannot be resolved, but they can be managed.
Right.
And the usual tools of management are diplomacy and deterrence. Right? And part of diplomacy is this idea, or the diplomacy of the Palestinian issue, is the idea of a two-state solution. That's a very different thing from, I can see a viable path, right? For a start, the war is not over yet, right? And the Israeli priority now, after 7 October, is to restore deterrence, which they have done substantially. There are a lot of paradoxes in the Middle East. It's a very complicated situation. First of all, first paradox. This is the first war, horrific as it is, in terms of humanitarian disaster, where the prospect of it leading to a wider conflagration, right, is almost zero. In almost every other Arab-Israeli war, the concern was it will spark U.S. Soviet global conflict. The prospect of that is zero now. Why? Because there's only one external power that matters in the Middle East. That's the US. Even China's Middle East diplomacy is mainly economic based, and the political part is largely performative, right? Russia has got its hands full in Ukraine.
But Iran is...
Iran is a regional power. Now, Iran, if there's going to be a big war in the Middle East, it's going to be over Iran's nuclear capability. Okay, now the Trump administration wants to try a negotiation. But what is the object of the negotiation? Look, the one paradox is, I told you, this is a horrific in terms of humanitarian disaster. In fact, there's more casualties. The only war that had more casualties is the Iran-Iraq war. That's something like 2 million. Nobody really knows for sure how many people died, civilian and military. But I think of the Arab-Israel wars, this is the largest, right? But it is, the prospect of it becoming a huge thing is almost zero. Right? Second paradox, Palestine has come back to center stage as an issue. But the prospects of a two-state solution have never been lower. Third paradox, Israel has never been more secure because it has destroyed Hamas as a coherent military force, it has destroyed Hezbollah as a coherent military force. It has, Israel had nothing to do with the fall of Assad, but they took advantage of it to destroy all the stocks of weapons there, right? And they have proven that Iran cannot defend itself. Iran shot something like in total almost 600 missiles, ballistic missiles, projectiles of various sorts. What damage was caused? Nothing significant. One Bedouin girl, 10 years old, injured. Fortunately, I understand she has recovered. 2 Israeli women injured slightly. 1 Bedouin man wandering in the wrong place got killed. Some damage to airfields, which were quickly repaired. And Iran's forward defense strategy, which was based on Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, is gone, right? Israel has demonstrated it can go and bomb targets in Iran and destroy it basically has destroyed all its most advanced air defense systems. So Iran has been exposed as ineffectual, but because of that, Iran has never been more dangerous. Because if all your conventional weapons are ineffectual, what is left? If I was an Iranian general, I say, okay, you want to start talking to the US, carry on. But right? The fourth paradox is all the Arab countries are clearly very upset over what's happening in Gaza. But that is largely a domestic political problem for them, for their people. Because no Arab country that has recognized Israel has broken diplomatic relations with Israel.
And that's, in fact, UAE has enhanced its
and even Saudi Arabia, one of the reasons for the 7 October attack, Saudi Arabia was on the cusp of reaching a deal with the US to recognize Israel.
Wow.
So, all right. So Saudi Arabia now needs... I was talking to quite a senior Saudi person not so long ago, not in Singapore, when on my travels, and he told me it was very interesting. I won't name him. He said, we need some kind of arrangement over Palestine. He didn't say solution. He said arrangement of Palestine. Then we can move forward with Israel. Right? Why are they doing that? Because all the headlines, and in fact, our talk about the Middle East is about the war, about destruction, terrorism. But actually, the real story in the Middle East is the efforts of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman to transform their economies. And they think this is a damn distraction.
Yeah.
From this is an existential issue for me. If there's going to be a Saudi Arabia or UAE or Oman or Qatar in 100 years' time, I must do this now. I don't have much time because there will be an energy transition, and then all my greatest asset is a diminishing asset. Now, I think the energy transition is going to take much longer than people think, right? But it will happen, right? So they know they have limited time, and for them, this is always of time. I need to go and focus on this is what is existential to me.
Right.
And in this effort, Israel can help me. The Palestine cannot. Israel has the technology, has the expertise, and so on, right?
Do you agree with the view that Israel is genociding the Palestinians, or is that just a reaction to the attack?
Genocide is a term that you throw at somebody you don't like, okay? There is a specific legal definition for what it was for the genocide. I can't remember it, but it means a deliberate attempt to eradicate a whole population, and I don't think that is so. They are just being very careless about collateral damage. That's a different matter. But then this is a pointless argument because which side you take on the argument is emotionally driven, not reasonable.
But then what would you tell, if I go to bring it back home, right? And let's say you have a 20-year-old niece that is feeling very strongly about this.
I will say
how would you explain Singapore's position?
I say our Singapore's position. I will explain it what I said by a version of what I said earlier. You want us to break diplomatic relations? Sure. But will it change anything? But it will just, we do have...
The answer might be that, but we'll be on the side of...
How do you know?
Humanity.
How do you know? What do you think humanity is?
Saving lives, keeping people alive.
Keeping people alive is a worthy goal, but it is not always a goal of your national interest. Your national interest may conflict with goals. The problem with life in general, I would tell a 20-year-old girl, is that there are many things that are desirable in life, but they are not mutually... You can't have them all at the same time. So you have to prioritize. Okay, it is quite legitimate for you to make an argument that we should prioritize feeling good, for example. But I can also make an equally legitimate argument, and I would think a more powerful argument that, feeling good should be subordinate to doing good. And the other things we do with Israel, not just the defense things, the R&D things, the management things, and so on, are also to the benefit of Singaporeans.
Right.
And how do you know that you're going to be the side of humanity? Because humanity is very hypocritical. If humanitarian reasons were the main reason, why did the Arab countries not break ties with Israel? Why did they not take, or they take only very reluctantly Palestinian refugees? Why?
We may not be friends with anyone if you're going with humanitarian reasons.
I would say to the young person, get real.
You
purposely paid a 20-year-old niece. There's a girl there. I thought you were going to be gentle about it.
No, smacked it up.
You give her a suplex.
You mentioned that like sometimes Singaporeans think that we're bigger than we are, and you've also mentioned in the past that we've been a target of like foreign influences and foreign interference of that sort. If we're not as big as we think we are, why are we a target of foreign influence?
Two things, and I think both are equally important.
Okay.
You only focus on half.
Okay.
We are not as big as some people think we are. Neither are we as small as some people think we are. Okay, both are equally important.
Yeah.
We have some influence in this region, and in fact, to some degree, globally. I wouldn't exaggerate it, but I wouldn't dismiss it completely either. So we are a worthy prize. The main foreign interference that we have to worry about, there are attempts by, say, the West to get us to accept some of their values. But frankly, I don't think that is very attractive except to a very narrow section of Singapore. There are attempts by some Muslim countries to get our Muslim population to adopt a certain type of interpretation of Islam, a more narrow, inward-looking type. And that's a bit more of a problem than the West because it's about 14-15%. But the main problem is China, because under Xi Jinping, the Chinese have adopted as a position that all Chinese, which means the Chinese defined ethnically, not nationally, should support his version of the China dream. That means they should define your interest in terms of China's interest.
Right.
Now that's very dangerous to Singapore. I think that's almost existential because Singapore is based on a different principle, despite the fact that 3/4 of Singaporeans are of Chinese ethnicity, right?
But he can say that, we just don't care what?
No, you can't because many of your population care.
Right.
Because most people in most countries, and Singaporeans are not unusual, don't think very deeply about politics or international relations and so on. And it is quite natural to feel some ethnic sentimentality or empathy, right? So when you hear something saying, oh, China is great, therefore we should all follow China.
Right.
The fellow, without thinking too much about it, will say, yeah, why not? And then he'll forget about it. But still, he does think it, right? And that's quite dangerous, because if you don't do something about this, over time, the idea of which modern Singapore is based, which is multi-racialism, will be eroded. And if you look in our whole region, the larger region, the region that some people now call the Indo-Pacific. That means from Northeast Asia down Southeast Asia to South Asia. In fact, you might as well extend it into the Middle East. Every other country, regardless of the type of political system, is actually based either formally or informally on ethnic and or religious hierarchy.
Right.
Except us. And it is a struggle, because I think it is something worth preserving. Now, you ask, why should anybody want to deal with a small country? That's a very good question. I used to tell MFA officers that, for a small country, the main imperative is to create relevance for yourself. There's no magic formula, right? But there are certain broad approaches. And one is, you cannot be normal. You have to be extraordinary. You have to be extraordinarily successful economically. You have to be extraordinarily technologically advanced militarily. And you have to be extraordinary in the way you organize ourselves. And we are, right? So that's something worth preserving. And that is the threat. Now, most Singaporeans don't think of these things. But the government does think of it. A lot of the things we have done in the last few years, when Lee Hsien Loong was president, the POFMA. There's got many reasons for it, but this is one of the reasons. Because social media, better or for worse, social media is constantly evolving, and so you need to have POFMA. You have FICA now, right? Because you don't want to use the ISA all the time. I think the core problem is this internal problem. If we can maintain this social cohesion amidst all kinds of pools, China is the main one. There is the Western one, the Islamic interpretation one, and there are even people. To me, it's a contradiction term, but there are radical forms of Hinduism and radical forms of Buddhism, which people are trying to propagate.
Or Christianity as well.
And Christianity as well, right? If you can manage this internal problem and maintain some kind of social cohesion, tight social cohesion, then you can deal with the external problems. But if you can't do this, then everything external becomes even more complicated and might get out of hand.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Was there anything you said that you felt maybe a bit
touchy?
Okay.
We have a community on our Telegram, and they actually have some questions for you. Were there any moments in your career, right, where your personal values and beliefs clash with the policy and your representation you have to do professionally? How do you resolve that conflict?
I think every diplomat, every country will at some point, to a greater or lesser degree, find this kind of conflicts, right? Mine, I can't say there was any very fundamental conflict. But I have been asked this question quite a lot, even by young diplomats when I was in the foreign ministry when I was PermSec. So I said, first of all, the fundamental value that you are serving is the national interest of Singapore. If you keep that in mind, it will reduce the conflicts, right? Because, you are not here for self-actualization, all right? You're here to serve a cause, and the cause is the national interest of Singapore. You keep that in mind, there will be less conflict. But you really cannot tahan, you can resign. Go with goodwill.